Hello, I'm Guy Boysen, professor of psychology at McKendree University, and I'm very happy to be here at MPA speaking to you about student evaluations of teaching. The title of my talk is How to Benefit from, Not Fear, Student Evaluations of Teaching. And I'm speaking today on behalf of the Society for Teaching of Psychology, and I want to give them a special thanks, especially Mira Kumaraju, who extended the invitation for me to give this talk to you today. Before I get into sort of the meat of what I'm going to talk about, I do want to give an example. And it's an example of the topic we're going to be discussing today, student evaluations of teaching. And what I want you to do is consider Professor B's student evaluations of teaching. Imagine that this is a scale from 1 to 5 with higher scores, meaning better teaching. And you've got Professor B's overall teaching effectiveness scores for 3 courses, and then a comparison mean as well. And I just want you to take a second and look over those means and do a little bit of interpreting. The next thing to consider is this. I want you to take another moment and rate your agreement on this 5-point scale with your impressions of Dr. B as an overall instructor, and then your impressions of the specific courses listed there. Hopefully you're able to come up with a rating, and I'm going to argue that if you gave Professor B ratings anything other than 3, you definitely should stay tuned for the rest of the talk. You fell into the trap that I laid for you to overinterpret student evaluations and use them maybe in ways that over-rely on them. And believe me, you're in good company. Lots of people do this. And I'm going to look at some possible ways that you might strategize to avoid these types of problems with your student evaluations and avoid having other people overuse these types of overinterpretations when they are evaluating your teaching. And specifically what I want to do today is talk about problems like overinterpretation and over-evaluation using student evaluations. And then I want to talk about some specific strategies that you could use to deal with those problems, both with improvement of your teaching with student evaluations, and then also with using them for things like evaluation of merit and promotion. And then finally talk about really focus in on the improvement process when you're using student evaluations of teaching. All right, so we're trying to avoid fear, so let's start with the bad stuff. Let's start with the causes of fear of student evaluations of teaching, the common problems. The first problem, and maybe you could argue the biggest problem, is poor measures of teaching effectiveness using student evaluations of teaching. And one problem I won't really be talking about much today, but I feel like it's worth mentioning, is people keep their student evaluations private. They're secrets that they're ashamed and afraid to speak about and talk about and show other people. I'm going to try and break that taboo a little bit today and actually show you some things, good and bad, from my teaching evaluation. So on the screen here, what you see is a teaching evaluation from quite a while ago when I was a new professor at McKendree University. And this is straight from the report we get when we have our student evaluations. And this is about the course. There's another section with additional items about the instructor, but this was the easiest one to pull out and show you. So here we go. We've got course for me, for the average of my division, and then the average of all courses at the university. And what you see here is there's some items that have face validity. The course improved my critical thinking, it was engaging, it was well organized, it was challenging, overall quality. But these measures are not something that has been validated and shown to be reliable and predictive of anything in particular. And so this is sort of a created at McKendree homegrown measure that's never been fully validated. So in a sense, it looks like it measures good teaching, but we don't really know if it does. I've actually analyzed this measure quite a bit over the years, and these items correlate very highly with each other. They correlate about 0.8 on a Pearson's correlation. They also have really high internal consistency, above 0.8 Chromebox alpha. So it seems like these items really hang together and are actually probably just measuring one thing, which is students' overall satisfaction with the course or their general impression of the instructor, perhaps. And so the lesson from this, I think, is that we don't know what this is measured, but yet we're using this to evaluate our teaching and to promote and give professors tenure. And I'd be willing to bet that a lot of you out there listening to this talk are being evaluated with measures that are homegrown and have maybe unknown or maybe even suspect validity, just like this one. And this is a problem. There are solutions, however. The next problem is that even though we have these measures oftentimes without great validity or with unknown validity, we tend to over-rely on them. If you're like me, in my first teaching job, the only evaluation I ever got of my teaching was somebody looking at my student evaluations. No observations, no other evidence. So we over-rely on teaching evaluations to determine whether someone is a capable teacher or not. I'll just give you a salient example that landed in my inbox just last month. So this, having published things on teaching evaluations, I get singled out sort of as an expert occasionally, but this was the first. I had a professor email me and say that they had been denied tenure by their provost because of a single item on their student ratings of instruction. Now, take this for what it's worth. I don't know the whole story. I don't know the whole backstory here, but basically this one item led the professor's tenure bid to be reversed at the administrative level after being approved at the departmental level. Now, I don't know if this is a fully true story, but you have to admit it sort of rings true, and that often there is an over-reliance on these student evaluation measures as the one thing that indicates whether someone is good enough to hire, to tenure, to promote, to be given merit. And we often also over-rely on them as a method for improving our teaching. In addition to over-relying on student evaluations of teaching, another cause of fear about them is the fact that people over-interpret them. Let's go back to the student evaluations I showed you earlier. A question that you might pose, and I certainly posed to myself back in 2013, is the quality of my course good enough? If I get a 4.33, but my colleagues have a 4.57, and all courses at my university are ridiculously high at 4.47, does that mean my quality is lower? And it's very tempting to interpret lower evaluations as lower quality. This is exactly what I was trying to do when I was sort of tricking you a little bit into over-interpreting Professor B's evaluations at the start of this talk. But here's the thing. You're in very, very good company if you did over-interpret these, or if you over-interpret your own student evaluations. A few years ago, I did some research on exactly this topic, over-interpretation of student evaluations of teaching. And I gave professors student evaluation reports like this. So if you look at this report, you'll notice that there are several means, and I give confidence intervals for those means, as well as confidence intervals for a comparison mean. And then I also give tests of significance, basically saying that there is no significant difference between any of these comparison means with the course means. So people who know statistics, who understand how to interpret these types of numbers should know that basically you shouldn't interpret any difference between that comparison mean of 4.31 and then any of the means for those individual courses. But yet, when I asked faculty members in English, psychology, and then mathematics to do just that, well, if you look at their scores for how much they thought that professor needed to improve each one of those courses, and you compare the lowest evaluation, so the course that had the lowest evaluation, and then medium and high, guess what happens? Among English professors, They give the highest rating of needs to improvement to the course with the lowest eval. That makes some sense. And then medium is lowest, and then high is a little bit lower yet. So each one of those differences is significant. So they're putting significant interpretations on means that clearly are not significantly different if you look at the actual statistics. Okay, so before we get on our high horse here in psychology and start judging the English professors, exact same trend among psychology professors. Mathematicians should know better. All they do is deal with numbers, right? Exact same trend. So there seems to be a heuristic that people use to evaluate student evaluations, and that is that higher is always better, lower is always worse. So rather than looking at the actual numbers and the statistics, people kind of use this general rule of thumb. The focus so far has been on student ratings, but of course, almost all student evaluations also have qualitative feedback. So students can give comments. So another problem number 4, is unhelpful feedback. The student comments we get on our evaluations are not always very useful. One thing that makes them not very useful in some cases is the fact that you get conflicting feedback. So that student evaluation I showed you earlier has those rating scales, but then it also has open-ended questions where students can talk about the things that most help their learning and least help their learning. So I basically just opened up a course of mine at random and showed that you can actually have completely opposite comments about the same things in your course. So for example, what most helped? One student says, the teamwork, the prep guides, and the work we did in class. It was very good. I loved. Student in the exact same class says, what didn't help their learning? Prep guides and team discussions. I felt we relied too heavily on these to learn the material. You are the professor. You should be teaching us the material. In addition to conflicting feedback, we can get vague feedback. So for example, the class is okay. However, the teacher needs to be more considerate to some students. Was not expecting the grade to be so specific. Guy Boysen dresses like a boss every day. Perhaps the most frustrating type of feedback we get is comments that are just complaining. The articles that went with the prep guides were a little long. Informal writings done outside of class weren't so helpful because some of them I did wrong and got marked off points for. I know that there's not really any way around quizzes, but I struggled on quizzes. And ultimately, at least for me personally, 95% of complaining boils down to just one thing: Dr. Boysen grades really hard. Now, at least these students were being civil in their comments. They very well could have crossed that line into just being uncivil and unprofessional in their comments. So incivility is another common problem that causes people to fear student evaluations of teaching. So Lindahl and Unger actually did a survey of teachers where they asked about cruelty in student evaluations of teaching. That's the title of the article. And I'll just pull out some of the cruel things that students said in these evaluations. I know high school students who can teach better than her. Hire a real professor to act as his permanent substitute. This guy's a joke. His class was a joke. His teaching was a joke, and his jokes sucked. Not very civil and not very useful feedback. Definitely something to fear from students. It's only fair if I pull out the cruelest thing that a student has said on my student evaluations. Here we go. He's a good teacher. I just don't like him as a person. In some cases, incivility can extend into bias. And unfortunately, in some cases, students do express their prejudices toward teachers in their student evaluations. This is a rather large research area that's really complex, and I wish I could give a whole talk just looking at bias in student evaluations and what the research actually says about how it happens, when it happens, and the size of it. But I just want to give one example. Every few years, you'll see in the college teaching literature and news, an article comes out that kind of makes a big splash. And this is one from a few years ago that did make a big splash. And it has sort of an interesting methodology that illustrates how bias can creep into student evaluations. So this actually was a very large study, tens of thousands of evaluations, hundreds of teachers. And what made it a really sort of interesting study was that the teachers were randomly assigned the students in their classes, because this happened in Europe and it was sort of like a general education program. And what they found, this is just a small sampling of stuff from their article here, but you can see it's broken down to male teachers and female teachers, but then also female students and male students. And the take-home message here is, if you look at the ratings of male teachers among male students, they tend to be systematically higher than any other group. So there is a tendency in this particular study to show this sort of small but significant difference that gives an advantage to male instructors. And the thing about it is, we know from psychology, even small correlations can end up having a big effect when they're systematic and they occur across many different situations. So bias is a potential problem that people definitely fear with student evaluations of teaching. So those are the problems. What about strategies to overcome the problems? That's the focus of the next section of the talk. And I'm going to go over 6 strategies that you can use in order to overcome the problems associated with student evaluations. First strategy, approach evaluations scientifically. So we have a picture of good old Wilhelm Wundt here in his Leipzig laboratory, basically founding psychology in this very picture. You know, one of the things he demonstrated was, in psychology, we know how to measure stuff. We know how to do stuff scientifically. And we still, to this day, are doing stuff scientifically. And so we should and can do student evaluations scientifically. We should approach them in the same rigorous way we approach everything else we do in the science of psychology. And if we do that, it's a solution for poor measures, over-reliance, over-interpretation, and bias. So one way that we can approach student evaluations scientifically is by using validated measures. Tons of validated measures out there for us to use. Just to cite an example, a review that came out a few years ago looked at published surveys, and they were published surveys just in the last decade of research at that point. And these people found 11 measures. They included 12 different subscales in some measures, a minimum of 2 on others. And so there's this huge variety of validated subscales that you can use to evaluate your teaching. Now, you might say, well, I don't have any control over what my summative end of semester evaluations are. That may be true, but there's absolutely nothing that prevents you from using these student evaluations to augment those, or just for your own professional development to improve. So for example, the teacher behavior checklist. This particular measure, created by psychology, used in psychology, it has subscales of caring and supportive, with items that relate to things like whether you're accessible, approachable, and a good listener. It also has a professional competency subscale with items related to things like your confidence, how creative you are, and your effectiveness as a communicator. So this has many items on it. They can be evaluated subscales or all together. And basically, it's kind of psychology's definition of what it means to be a master teacher. What are the characteristics of master teachers in psychology? More broadly, the student evaluation of educational quality measure is probably one of the best, if not the best, most researched, most highly validated measures of student evaluation quality. It includes 9 subscales. Each one of these things stands on its own or can be totaled together for overall evaluation. Let's say you're an online teacher. Maybe these kind of classroom-focused evaluations aren't going to work for you. There are some web or internet or online evaluations available to you. So for example, the web-based quality of education scale, it does include sort of basic teaching skills like content delivery, instructor and peer interaction, But then it also includes some online specific things. So if you want feedback about how your web page for your course is set up, whether there's technical issues that students are facing, whether the online apps that students are using are actually helping them, then there's options even for that. So let's take a step back. If you remember a few slides ago, I was talking about whether or not this difference between my rating of overall quality in all courses at my university was something that I should be interpreting or not. And so the next way we can approach student evaluation scientifically is to use statistics. So if my mean is 4.33, the university mean is 4.47 with a standard deviation of 9.1, is this something that I should be interpreting as meaningful? Well, I'm going to argue that there's an easy answer to this, and that's to use statistics. So you might look at the standard deviation. In this case, we're talking about 15% of a standard deviation. If you convert that then to perhaps effect sizes, we're talking about a small effect size. Perhaps you like confidence intervals. If you calculate a confidence interval for this, you can see that it overlaps with the university-wide mean. And then the coup de grace here, you could look at statistical comparisons and show that there's a non-significant test between these two means. So no, 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 and no. Even though it kind of looks like on the face of it that that quality is lower, it is not a significant difference that should be interpreted. Now, this is all fine if you have means, but we also get those comments from students. And what I would also encourage you to use is take the qualitative approach that qualitative researchers do. They don't just interview people and then just kind of give a gist of what they said. No, they have systematic ways of evaluating what people said. So take that approach with your student comments. Don't just read them for gist, do them in an organized way somehow. So for example, you could create a chart that breaks down what the qualities of a good teacher are. So in this particular case, what I've done is I've broken down by Chickering and Gameson's kind of very famous 7 principles of high quality education. And what you can do is use this to basically kind of score, if you will, your student evaluation comments. So for example, you could break it down into comments that show that you are doing these things and comments that show that you might need to improve in those things. So to give an example, student-faculty contact. If students say things like, hey, this professor comes to class and they are available for questions after class and before class, that might be an affirming comment. If you comments like, this professor really isn't very good at responding to emails, that might be an improvement-based comment. And just to give you an example of what a different one of these might look like with some actual coding in it. So you don't have to use Chickering and Gameson. You can use whatever you would define teaching quality as. So you could use these categories rather than those. And what you would want to do is organize based on the number of the comments and summarize these comments. So not only is this good for you because you won't focus in on certain positive comments or certain negative comments, you can get a sense of how frequently those comments occur. It is a great way to summarize your comments for other people to try and prevent them from making that same mistake of honing in on just a certain type of comment because it's very long or very well written or very dramatic in some way. Strategy number 2, make sure you ask for the type of feedback that you want. Now, of course, we have a picture of good old B.F. Skinner here feeding the hopper in a Skinner box to give a food pellet to a rat who is being reinforced for the response of pressing that lever. So we know from psychology that feedback is essential for behavior change and learning. If the rat pressed that lever and it didn't get the feedback of a food pellet, it wouldn't do that. And you can put yourself in the rat's shoes here, because if you don't get the type of feedback from students that's useful for you to change your teaching, then you're not going to be able to improve. So ask for the type of feedback you want, and this is a solution for unhelpful feedback, incivility, and bias. One of the things that I like to do, and a suggestion I would make for getting the type of feedback you want, is to explain evaluations to students. They're so second nature to us, we just kind of assume perhaps that students know what they're for and how we use them, but that's not necessarily the case. So one of the things I always do when I'm first talking about evaluations at the end of the semester is I talk about how my college uses student evaluations of teaching. And I tell students that we take these at McKendree University very seriously. They are part of the decision process on whether someone actually gets hired to teach at the university, whether they can continue teaching at the university, whether they get promoted, and that they are something that is very valued at the institution. And I talk about how much I value them as well. And I do this for both my end of semester evaluations and sort of my midterm or early semester sort of formative or informal feedback that I ask for. And so I tell them how I use the feedback. For end of semester, I say, I'll look at these as soon as the semester is over to figure out if there's any changes I need to make next semester. For sort of midterm, I say, if there's something that arises where students have consensus that there's a problem in the course, I will work to correct it in the rest of the semester. And I like to give examples of changes that I've made. Across all of my courses, I usually have one or two examples of things where I can say, hey, this thing that I do that you like? The reason I do that is because students gave me feedback about it and told me to do it a semester or two ago. And I try and motivate them to give good feedback. And the other strategy is I explain to them what's useful and not useful. I tell them that really the comments that they make should be based on things that I could change to make the course better, to help them learn. And I tell them that some things are not useful, that things that are, just complaining or just saying, I don't like it, or this is stupid, does not help anyone improve the course. And that they should think about the next students who are going to take this course and doing things that will allow me to help those students. And I also am very frank with them in saying that if you state things about me or about the course that are uncivil or insulting or just kind of immature, then that doesn't really reflect poorly on me. It reflects poorly on you. The people who look at those, including me, will probably discount what you have to say because it makes you look bad. It doesn't make the teacher look bad. So approach them professionally because that's what your teachers are going to do. So what else can you do to get good feedback? Give good measures. Give good measures that have sub-factors, and feel free to use those sub-factors to get exactly the feedback you want. So for example, there's no reason why you couldn't take the group interaction sub-factor from the student evaluation of educational quality and administer it after every class where you have groups working together to collaborate to see if students are liking or not liking that. In terms of qualitative feedback, getting feedback from students, if you're like me, that tends to be more useful than numbers. And so I tend to use two main qualitative feedback devices. And I usually do those typically in like the first, about after the first test usually, and then sometimes later in the semester as well. And one that I like is a stop, start, continue. If you just ask students for general feedback, what do you like, what's going well, they're probably going to give you general feedback to those general questions. If you want more specific feedback, ask them specific questions like, what should we stop doing in this class? What should we start doing in this class? And what should we continue doing in this class? So I like start, stop, continue. But the feedback that I really, really love is this one. I do this every semester just about, and this is a learning focused evaluation. It's really about what is helping students learn and what they perceive as not helping them learn. And one of the things I really love about this is it's broken down into what I'm doing as the teacher, but also what the students are doing. And this puts a lot of responsibility in the students' hands in terms of recognizing that it's not just my responsibility for them to learn. they have to do some things too. And it allows me as the instructor as well to see if a student doesn't think something is working well. I can put that in the context of what they're doing to make it work. And so this is a highly useful piece of feedback that you get from students. And I would encourage you to find the questions or the scales that work for you to get exactly the feedback that you're going to find useful. Strategy number 3, I'm going to encourage you to claim immunity for good pedagogy. We know how people learn in psychology. We know this all the way back to Ebbinghaus and his forgetting curve. So we know that people forget things fairly quickly unless they repeat them. And the more you repeat them, the better learned they are. Not only do we know this about how people will learn, we have 150 years of other things that have led us to know how people learn and how to effectively teach people. And so we know what works. And what you should do, no matter what students say, is use what works. And you can ignore student comments that are directly contradictory to doing good pedagogy. So this is a solution for unhelpful feedback. And I'll just give you an example of how I do this. So my abnormal psychology course from this semester, and one of the pages I have on them talks about how students will learn in the course. And if you zoom in on this, you'll notice that I have stuff we know about how people learn. We know that people learn from spaced practice. We know that they learn by repeating things and by testing themselves during that spaced practice. We know that thinking deeply about things in deep processing, the meaning, applying things, applying it to yourself leads people to learn. And we know that people learn better when they collaborate on activities related to learning. And so I explain this from the very first day of class to students, and I use it when they give me feedback on what they like and don't like about the course. So one, just a random semester that I pulled out in terms of feedback from that learning form I just had on the screen there. If you break it down into helping learning and not helping learning, this is from that same abnormal psych course. And if you focus just in on what they said was not helping them learn, you can feel free to ignore pedagogy here. So for example, students always want copies of the slides. No, I'm not going to give them copies of the slides because it motivates them not to come to class, because they don't have to come to class to get the few notes that I give. It also, when they're in class, it makes them not have to pay as much attention. They can be distracted rather than focused on what I'm talking about. Team discussion. Collaboration works. It's an active learning technique that's been shown over and over and over again to lead to learning. So even though some students don't like it, we're going to keep doing it. Requiring reading for class. Of course, we're going to keep doing that no matter what students say, because that is an essential preparation for learning. It's a repetition. It requires deep learning. And then even though students sometimes feel like they're teaching themselves, what I would argue is if you're doing good pedagogy, the students should be teaching themselves, because the only way you learn is by actively doing things. So no matter what students say about these good pedagogical strategies, I'm not going to eliminate them from my courses, because I am claiming immunity for things that we know lead to learning. Strategy number 4 is to take control of evidence for effectiveness. On your right, a very famous figure from a very famous study, one of psychology's most influential, in fact, Smith and Glass's meta-analysis of the comparison between people who've been treated in psychotherapy and those in a control group. That meta-analysis was a reaction to decades of criticism and studies that showed that in some cases, psychotherapy didn't have a good effect. And some people said that psychotherapy did nothing. So what Smith and Glass did is they took all of the evidence, various studies of various types, and combined them to make an overall case for the effectiveness of psychotherapy. And I'm going to encourage you to also take control of the overall evidence that you are a good teacher. And that evidence goes well beyond just student evaluations of teaching. So this is a solution for poor measures, over-reliance, and bias. How can you show that you're a good teacher? Well, Burke and other people have pointed out that there are many ways to demonstrate good teaching. You can use student satisfaction, but there's also experts who might evaluate you. You might show that learning outcomes are positive or that your professional contributions are meaningful. So student satisfaction, even just looking at student satisfaction, student evaluation surveys are just a couple of the ways that you can provide evidence that you're an effective teacher. You can also have other people like your peers, yourself, administrators, review not only your teaching, but your materials for teaching. Perhaps the most important evidence for teaching effectiveness is learning outcomes. Can you prove that students are learning? And then, are you also someone who is making professional contributions and is respected because of your scholarship of teaching, the fact that you're training other teachers, that you're providing service to the profession? So what I would encourage you to do if you're trying to figure out if you're a good teacher is to look at all of this evidence. And perhaps more importantly, when you are making the case to other people that your teaching has merit, that you deserve tenure, that you deserve a promotion, use all of this evidence, not just student evaluations. And really, if you think about it, if you can show that you have 13 or 14 different pieces of evidence that indicate you're a good teacher, well, then the importance of that one piece of evidence, summative student evaluations, really shouldn't give you as much sort of fear as it might otherwise. Strategy number five is about documenting mitigating factors. We have the famous newspaper article, 37 who saw murder didn't call the police, apathy at stabbing of Queens woman. And of course, the Queens woman is Kitty Genovese. And although the initial reports on the Kitty Genovese murder blamed the potential witnesses who did nothing, social psychology quickly showed that actually that's a lot of fundamental attribution error going on. There were mitigating factors. There was diffusion of responsibility, and that bystanders actually can't necessarily be blamed as apathetic if they don't intervene. So there were mitigating factors. Mitigating factors affect our behavior and the outcomes of things all the time, and student evaluations are no different. So this is a solution for potential bias, overinterpretation, and over-reliance on student evaluations of teaching. Non-instructional factors, they do influence student evaluations of teaching. And when I'm talking about non-instructional factors, I'm talking about things that reduce student evaluations, but are not actual teaching. We know some of the things that actually do influence student evaluations that aren't teaching. So if you are teaching math or science content, you got that stats class, man, I think those evaluations are probably going to be lower just because it's math content. That's related to the idea that it's going to be lower perhaps because it's required and students have less of a motivation to enroll. And they also probably think that they're going to get lower grades. Each of these things is a biasing factor that reduces student evaluations of teaching. In addition, lower level courses and larger courses are more likely to have student evaluations that are slightly lower. So that high level grad seminar is probably going to have high evaluations compared to that lower level intro course. Well, it has come to this. We're talking about Rate My Professor. I'm going to show you an evaluation that I pulled off this website. So this is a very low rating of quality for this course, and the student says in this case, the worst prof and class I have ever had. Could have been interesting material, but taught from very biased angles on his interests and beliefs. Very arrogant, rigid, boring prof. Now, I don't know this professor personally, but I know of him because he's one of our most eminent professors in psychology. So eminent, in fact, that he has an American Psychological Association award named after him. All right, so I've never seen Stanley Su teach. I don't know him personally, but I do know that he's an Asian American man who is a clinical psychologist who's extremely well known for his teaching and work in promoting multicultural psychology. So with that in mind, comments like these sort of take on a different perspective. Is the student actually not pleased with the course, or are they not pleased with the identity of Stanley Su and perhaps the message that he gives when he teaches about multicultural topics? The idea here is simply that students may express bias on student evaluations. There are some strategies you can use to mitigate these non-instructional factors. For example, you might just have to understand that some of these non-instructional factors need to be considered in your interpretations of student evaluations. It may be that that stats course, that lower evaluation, has nothing to do with how well you're teaching it, and you should not worry about always having to bring it up to some other standard. You also should consult with other people about these situations where you think non-instructional factors might be influencing your student evaluations. People who teach the same courses or have had some of the same experiences are going to have great advice on what you should do or not do with the student feedback you're receiving. And these people also might be advocates when you use student evaluations for tenure, merit, and in the evaluation process. They are going to be advocates who can say and vouch for the fact that this is a good teacher, but they're not really about their teaching that are influencing their student evaluations. And make sure you have those people who can speak to those situations for you. And the final thing you can do is really think about the idea that these non-instructional effects tend to be pretty small. We're talking about a fraction of a standard deviation, less than variations that tend to occur just from error variance and fluctuation from semester to semester. They do not mean that student evaluations and student feedback should be just tossed out and ignored. And really, you can still use student evaluations, even if there are some non-instructional factors influencing them, for improvement. And that leads us to the next point, which is that you should engage in a feedback process that allows you to improve based on student evaluations. This process, the steps in it are really familiar to us. We know them from the assessment process that's required in higher education, where you set learning goals, facilitate learning, then assess outcomes and make revisions. If you're a good teacher, if you're using backward design, you know this assessment process. You also know it because it's essential to psychology research, the idea that we observe and then we test hypotheses, and then we use those to feed back into our theories that explain our observations. So the steps start with identifying areas for feedback. Once you know what you want feedback on, you can figure out what's the best method to get that feedback. Then you can gather student responses, interpret those things systematically, and set a goal for change. And then finally, follow up. Go back to the beginning. See if the change had the effect that you wanted it to. If you think about this improvement process, it maps quite nicely with the strategies that I've been talking about in the previous section of this talk. So identifying areas for feedback. Well, you want to use varied sources of teaching effectiveness. It might not just be low spots on your teaching evaluations or comments suggesting improvement from students. It could be outcomes of student learning. It could be suggestions peers have made. It could be your self-evaluations of things that you want to develop as a teacher. Getting feedback, use valid measures, and ask for the specific feedback that's going to be useful to you. When you have that feedback, use statistics to interpret it. Use qualitative methods to systematically look at what students are giving you feedback on in terms of their comments. And then when you're setting goals for change, consult with experts. And no matter what, set aside some immunity for that good pedagogy. Keep students satisfied. That is extremely important, but also teach them. They should learn. And of course, follow up to make sure that these things are having the effect that you want them to. To conclude, let's bring it back to the most important thing. You teaching your courses effectively and benefiting students, allowing them to learn, and allowing them to be satisfied with the way that they are learning. Student evaluations of teaching are consequential, controversial, and escapable. They're consequential because they affect our careers. And they're consequential because if used correctly, they can improve our teaching. Because they have such an outsized impact and have certain systematic flaws, they're also controversial. But here's the thing, they're not going anywhere. They're inescapable. And I would argue that that's a good thing because they help us keep in mind who we're actually doing this for. We're doing it for the students. And ultimately, if they don't benefit, we're not doing our jobs a good way. And to show you that I'm not just sort of preaching things I don't believe, this is a picture of me teaching. And it was a random day that a photographer showed up to get images of people teaching in the classroom. And look what just happens to be on the board that day. The second bullet point on our class agenda for the day is feedback on the class. So I'm not someone who's just telling you what to do and not doing it myself. I take feedback seriously and I believe in it. I hope that I've convinced you that you can get over some of the fears and some of the problems of student evaluations if you adopt some of these strategies that I outlined today. Thank you very much for listening to my talk. I hope to see you in person at future conferences. In the meantime, if you have any questions, you can certainly email me. And if you like the type of material I talked about today, feel free to look at some of my publications that I've done by myself or with my colleagues about teaching or about the profession of psychology. And have a good rest of the semester and stay safe.